Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for attending this event, which is launching the report published by Global Humanitarian Assistance on the role of Zakat in humanitarian financing. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Abdurrahman Sharif, and I work for the Muslim Charities Forum, an umbrella organization of UK-based Muslim NGOs. And some of the largest Islamic NGOs are part of our membership, and I'm going to chair the session today. And I think this event today comes at a very good time where there are lots of discussions about the future of the humanitarian system and the future of humanitarian funding at a time where actually the needs are greater than the funds that are available, and there are a lot of agencies that are exploring ways forward in which we can fill that gap. Also at a time where for us Islamic agencies, we have for a number of years talked about the importance of Zakat in supporting key development and humanitarian aid work in different parts of the world. Not only Zakat coming from Muslim countries, but also Zakat coming from West and from Muslim communities who want to fulfill their religious obligations. And obviously, if you're not aware, in the UK, there's a big contribution that goes to charities from Zakat and Islamic donations and so on. And I can tell you, for instance, that from the data we've researched in the UK, that last year, in the past year, for instance, Islamic charities received about 500 million pounds of contributions for charitable work, most of it coming obviously from Muslim communities and private donations. But I would like to start the day today by introducing some of our panelists. On my right, Chloe, who was the author of the report and who's a program advisor at GHA. Chloe leads the GHA program's work on private funding and humanitarian assistance, and works with International Aid Transparency Initiative to improve transparency and reporting of humanitarian financing. Before joining development initiatives, Chloe established an international volunteer program for an NGO working with displaced children in Colombia, where she also studied for a diploma in social and community project management. And then we have Dr. Abdul Wahab Nurwali. Dr. Abdul Wahab Nurwali is a trustee of the Humanitarian Forum, Islamic Relief, and is also representative of WAMI, the World Assembly of Muslim Youth. Dr. Nurwali is currently a professor of clinical biochemistry at King Abdul Aziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and we're grateful that he came all the way from Saudi Arabia for this event today. He's on the board of a number of charities, as mentioned, and also acts as a strategic advisor to the General Secretary of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Dr. Nurwali's landmark projects include youth empowerment and entrepreneurship initiatives, and his work generally covers a wide range of development experience throughout Asia, Africa, and Central Asia. And on my left, we have Louisa Chekar from Islamic Relief. Louisa is a graduate from Oxford University. She worked with Islamic Relief now for 3.5 years, and is currently working in the programs department there. Amongst her responsibilities, she is also tasked with allocating funding for projects, which includes also Zakat. She has also just recently completed an extensive research work within Islamic Relief to develop Islamic Relief Worldwide Zakat policy. And then on the extreme left, we have Dr. Habib Ahmed, who is a professor of Islamic finance at Durham University Business School. Before joining Durham University as the Sharjah Chair, Dr. Habib was manager of the research and development at the Islamic Banking Development Groups in Saudi Arabia. He also worked at the Islamic Research and Training Institute of the Islamic Development Bank Group in Saudi Arabia and taught at the University of Connecticut in the USA and in a number of universities. He has been a member of the Capital Adequacy Working Group of Islamic Financial Services Board, which is responsible for, amongst other things, setting standards and guidelines for Islamic banks and financial institutions. Dr. Habib is passionate about Zakat. He's written extensively on the subject and about its potential role in reducing poverty in many countries around the world. Without no further ado, I would like to start the event today with a welcome message from Dr. Jamila Mahmoud, who is the Chief of the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat. Dr. Jamila is very passionate about this subject. Unfortunately, she wanted to be here in person, but couldn't make it, and has recorded a message for us. For those of you who don't know Dr. Jamila Mahmoud, she's a medical professional and founded Mercy Malaysia in 1999, and she led it for a decade and has worked on numerous disasters and conflict zones globally. She was the Chief of Humanitarian Response at UNFPA from 2009 and 2011 and is currently the Chief of the World Humanitarian Summit and Senior Visiting Research Fellow at King's College London. She focuses on disaster management and was also previously a trustee of Save the Children. If you could get the message from Dr. Jamila.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings.
Whilst everything is being prepared, I just wanted to let you know, so we have a Twitter hashtag, which is GHA Zakat 2015. So we encourage you to tweet, and anyone who's following us online, we encourage them to ask questions online, and you'll get the opportunity for those questions to be answered in the Q&A session later on today. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings. Hello to everyone in London. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be able to give you a short message. I'm terribly sorry that I cannot be there personally, although I would have loved to. First of all, let me congratulate Development Initiatives for this excellent and very timely piece of work, and also to the Muslim Charities Forum for hosting this very important event. I am the Chief of the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat, and the World Humanitarian Summit is an initiative of the Secretary General that will actually call upon all the different stakeholders to come together, to think and to discuss and to find ways that we can address the growing humanitarian challenges in the world today. Never before have we faced such challenges in our time. Disasters are striking more frequently and more intensely, affecting millions of people around the world. By the end of 2013, more than 51 million people have been displaced due to conflict. Now this is more than any time since World War II. Humanitarian crises halt or even reverse development progress. It means that many millions of people who are the most vulnerable in the world are really in grave danger of being left behind. And these are not short-term problems. The average displacement of people, particularly following major crises and conflict, is 17 years. In terms of financial needs, for 2015 alone, in the last 3 months, the UN's appeal requests support for 57.5 million people at a cost of $16.4 billion. This is a 446% increase since 2003. On average, 35% of the United Nations appeals remain unfunded. It is on this background that we need to rethink how we will be able to finance humanitarian crises and meet the needs of people affected by them. This paper, An Act of Faith and the Role of Humanitarian Financing and Zakat, is extremely important for us to start examining whether there are alternative streams of funding that are already in existence that can be brought into the humanitarian arena. We all know that whatever faith one belongs to, the act of giving and the act of alms giving is something that is inherent in each culture. In Zakat, this paper has shown how the potential of this compulsory giving in the Muslim population can actually be harnessed to meet some of the demands that are facing refugees and people displaced by crisis. I believe this is a beginning of more intense work that needs to be done, and indeed at the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat, this is one of the areas that we are studying in more detail and engaging with a multitude of stakeholders, including banks, organizations of Islamic jurisprudence, regional organizations, and UN organizations as well as NGOs, to look at how can we find ways to channel appropriate amounts of funds to meet some of these demands. I think it's really important that we try to find the solutions that can meet local needs, so that each community and each constituency that is providing zakat can actually meet some of the demands which are actually quite local. So I congratulate development initiatives. I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us to continue doing more work on this, so that we will find a way to really reshape aid. We will find a way to bring different actors to play their roles, and we find a way to legitimize some of the funding that goes through Islamic social giving and capture the immense contributions from these channels. Congratulations and thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. I wish you a very, very good and productive day.
Thank you very much. Well, I think Dr. Jamila couldn't, express it in a better way, and the challenge, are big for us, and the challenge also to identify new sources of finances to support the humanitarian needs. So, without no further ado, I would like to ask Chloe Sterk, who is the author of this report, to go through it and present it to us in a simplified way, but also talk to us about the work of development initiatives and the global humanitarian assistance program.
Thank you. Welcome everybody, thank you for coming. Welcome also to those of you watching online, thank you for joining virtually. Just to say, the presentation that I'm going to talk through should be available for you under the video stream if you are watching online, so you can just click through the slides through that. So I'm just going to start off by very briefly introducing development initiatives and the Global Humanitarian Assistance Programme, and then I'll go on to explain a little bit about what led us to carry out this research into Zakat, why we chose to focus specifically on Zakat, and I'll then cover the key findings of the report in terms of our estimated, what we think the estimated value of Zakat is, and some examples of how it's being used through some case studies, and I'll then give a very brief overview of some of the key barriers that we might envisage in efforts to maximise the humanitarian potential of Zakat, followed by an overview of our recommended areas of focus for taking these discussions forward. I'm assuming everybody here knows what Zakat is, but in case anybody doesn't, Zakat is a form of Islamic social financing, and through Zakat, all Muslims whose wealth falls above a certain threshold are required to pay, to give 2.5% of their assets each year to help people in need. So Development Initiatives is a primarily a research organisation that works to improve the availability, accessibility and usability of data to enable evidence-based decisions that deliver more effective use of resources to end poverty. The Global Humanitarian Assistance Programme is a programme within Development Initiatives that seeks to bring clarity to the largely quite complicated picture of humanitarian financing and to humanitarian crises. So the GHA programme seeks to answer questions around where humanitarian assistance comes from, where it goes, how it gets there, and in what form. And by providing clear, objective and evidence-based information on the resources going to people in crises, we hope to inform policy and practice and support decision makers to channel available resources where they're most needed. Oh, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Sorry. So, why Zakat? Well, as Dr. Jamila explained in her presentation, in her introduction, there is a significant humanitarian funding shortfall and there isn't enough financing available to meet the rapidly growing humanitarian needs across the world. There are a number of high-level processes going on at the moment to look at ways we might be able to fill that gap with alternative financing resources. And one area that is being looked at is the potentially vast resource of Zakat. We know that Zakat is currently already being used to respond to crises, but the question is whether or not there's potential for it to do more. However, there's very little in terms of an evidence base around Zakat. There's very little known in terms of its global value. Previous estimates have suggested it could be anywhere between $200 billion and $1 trillion a year. So this report is really an attempt to start building that evidence base to inform those discussions. So I just want to start by taking a step back and looking at the role of faith in humanitarian assistance and faith-based organisations. So faith plays a really key role in humanitarian financing and delivery. The graph on the slide that you can see shows how much humanitarian funding is that is channeled through NGOs, goes through faith-based organisations, and we can see that over 15% every year goes to faith-based organisations. So it's a significant amount. We actually calculated that if the top 5 faith-based organisations were classed alongside government donors, then their private humanitarian income would rank them the 14th largest provider of humanitarian assistance in 2013. All major religions obviously have some element of alms giving within them, but Zakat seems to be the only example that we've come across of mandatory alms giving, which is what makes it unique in that respect. And it's the mandatory nature of Zakat that means that while it can be relatively straightforward to work with other forms of faith-based giving, Zakat is a little bit more complicated because it requires a much more detailed understanding of the religious factors associated with its collection and its use, such as who it can be used for, where it can be used, etc. And because of this, Zakat is not very well understood by the wider humanitarian community, by many of the organisations and actors involved in the international humanitarian response system, which is another reason why we chose to focus this research on Zakat in particular. There were also some clear links between Zakat and humanitarian assistance, which I'm going to explain in a bit more detail now. So the objective of humanitarian assistance is to save lives, alleviate suffering, and maintain human dignity in the aftermath of a crisis. But also in practice, humanitarian assistance actually covers much more than this, including preparedness, prevention, and recovery. According to the Quran, Zakat is intended for 8 very specific groups of people who are represented on this slide. And while there are very clear links between the kind of overarching theological and ideological purpose of Zakat and the moral purpose of providing humanitarian assistance, there are also very specific connections between these groups of people and some of the people who might be in need of humanitarian assistance. These links are covered in much more detail in Figure 3 in the report, but I'm just going to give you some examples of those connections. So some of the more obvious ones would be the poor. So the majority of people living in humanitarian crises are also living in chronic poverty. So that category is relevant to a lot of people living in crisis. The needy is a category that could apply to anybody in need of assistance in the aftermath of a crisis. And the wayfarer or the stranded traveller, which could apply to refugees and IDPs. But as well as definitional connections, there were also some important geographic links. So Islamic countries and those with large Muslim populations are really growing in significance at the moment as both humanitarian donors and recipients. Between 2011 and 2013, international humanitarian assistance from members of the Organisation for Islamic Cooperation grew almost fourfold to over $2.2 billion in 2013. And at the same time, an estimated 75% of the people living in the top 10 recipient countries of humanitarian assistance were Muslims. The map on the slide shows in blue the top 25 humanitarian donors of 2013. In orange it shows the top 25 humanitarian recipients, and the countries that are covered in little black speckled dots are the OIC member countries. And if we zoom in on Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, we can see the significant overlap both among donors and recipients. And it just shows that Zakat is really a potentially very significant resource for both humanitarian donors and recipients in the Muslim world. And going forward, it's only going to become more relevant. The collective economy of Islamic and Muslim majority countries is currently one of the fastest growing in the world, and the world's Muslim population is also growing at a faster rate than the wider global population. And so these growing economies and populations in Muslim countries offer further potential for Zakat to grow in the coming years, which means it's likely to become an even more relevant source of support for people living in humanitarian crises. So the big question, what is Zakat worth and what is it spent on? Well, because there's no global data or evidence available on Zakat, we based our research on case studies of individual countries to get an indication of its value. And data we collected for Indonesia, Malaysia, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Yemen shows that in these countries alone, a combined total of $5.7 billion is collected in Zakat through formal Zakat collection mechanisms in a year. It's likely, however, that the actual amount of Zakat paid in these countries is significantly larger, and this is for two main reasons. Firstly, many people prefer to pay their Zakat directly to the person receiving it rather than through a third party, but also evidence suggests a lack of trust in some of the institutions, particularly government-managed institutions responsible for collecting and managing Zakat, can lead many people to pay their Zakat outside of those formal mechanisms. And because of methodological issues, it's not very easy for us to scale up the data that we've collected to get a kind of precise global estimate of the value of Zakat. But we can say with some confidence that it's certainly, Zakat collected through formal mechanisms around the world is certainly going to be in the tens of billions of dollars. And if you take into account Zakat paid outside of those formal mechanisms, then it's far more likely to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm now just going to give a couple of examples of our findings from two case studies to look at how Zakat is used, in specifically how it's used for the extent to which it's used for humanitarian assistance already. So the first country I'd like to look at is, the first case study is the Zakat Foundation of America, which is an independent Zakat collection distribution agency based in the US, and it's intended primarily to be used by US-based Muslim citizens. So in 2013, the foundation received just under $10 million in contributions. And of its total expenditure in the same year, you can see that the vast majority, 57%, was spent on emergency aid. Of that, the vast majority was spent internationally in countries like Philippines, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Syria and Mali, but some of it was also spent domestically within the US. If we compare that to Indonesia, Indonesia is home to the largest Muslim population in the world, and unlike the US, obviously it's a developing country. Now, as Zakat is linked to personal wealth, one would expect it to have greater potential revenue in more prosperous countries and less so in poorer countries, and Indonesia is a good example of this. Indonesia is becoming more prosperous, so in the last 10 years, in the 10 years since 2004, its GDP has more than trebled, and in the same period, Zakat collected has increased 30-fold. Meanwhile, international humanitarian assistance going into Indonesia has reduced from over $1 billion in 2005 in the aftermath of the tsunami to just over $50 million in 2012, so that's a reduction of 20 times. So the main Zakat collection agency in Indonesia is known as Basnas, and Basnas allocates Zakat to 4 different categories. And you can see that here as well, of them in 2012, humanitarian assistance was again the largest recipient sector, receiving 41% of all Zakat allocated. allocated by Basnas in Indonesia. We can't be sure, but we think that most, if not all of that, was spent domestically. So it's clear that Zakat is providing significant funds for humanitarian assistance already around the world. I'm now just going to give a very brief overview of some of the potential barriers that we've identified that might affect efforts to mobilise Zakat for humanitarian assistance on a greater scale, and 5 key areas for action that we think should help support any such efforts. So in terms of the barriers, these are covered in much more detail in the report, but broadly they fall under 2 main categories. The first of which is logistical barriers, and this includes reporting and traceability issues, a lack of systematised collection and coordination, and the question of how Zakat should be collected. The second category is ideological barriers, and these include issues such as who can receive Zakat, where it can be spent, and when it needs to be spent. So in terms of the kind of key areas for action that we think would help to support efforts to increase Zakat use for humanitarian assistance. Firstly, we believe that the humanitarian community needs to engage in discussion with academics and Islamic scholars, theologians and practitioners, and share learning on the use of Zakat for humanitarian assistance. Secondly, we believe guidance needs to be provided on the collection and use of Zakat for humanitarian assistance. There also needs to be improved channels between Zakat funds given and the international humanitarian response system. Fourthly, efforts should be focused on increasing Zakat revenues rather than diverting existing funds from elsewhere. And finally, any efforts to increase the use of Zakat for humanitarian assistance really should be combined with efforts of the wider development community to also increase resources provided through Islamic social finance and Zakat in order to ensure a complementary approach. So just to end, Zakat is clearly already being used to support people in crisis across the world. But the question is, if in addition to the key role it's already playing, the humanitarian community is seeking to mobilise Zakat on a greater scale, then collective efforts need to be carefully considered, coordinated and targeted, and evidence will be key to any decisions made in that area. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions after the discussion, or alternatively you can come up to me and speak to me when we're finished. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Louis. I think you couldn't explain it better. As we know, unfortunately, a big number of humanitarian crises happen to be in countries with a majority Muslim population, and that's an important factor to consider as we hear at the moment, for instance, the crisis in Yemen, which is getting worse and sadly and dramatic. But also that you have new donors that are coming into prominence, such as Turkey, for instance, and I think I heard that Turkey is now the 3rd largest humanitarian donor, although some people are questioning the stats, but also it's also challenging the humanitarian system in the sense that last week I attended a talk about Turkish foreign policy and its humanitarian aid, and what people, the audience was asking, how come, for instance, a country like Turkey was so present in Somalia and the rest of the community couldn't be seen? And I think one also other thing that needs to be challenged is the amount of bureaucracy as well that we have put into the humanitarian system, which countries like Turkey are challenging. I would like now to ask Dr. Habib Ahmed to comment on the findings of this report from a policy perspective of a leading Islamic scholar and focusing on the extent that Zakat is currently being used to support the humanitarian response and its potential as a source of future humanitarian financing.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. Actually, I think I've read the report, and Shreya has done a very good job in terms of identifying the key issues, not only at the conceptual level, but also in terms of the operational issues that are needed to be addressed in order to use Zakat in humanitarian kind of activities. Now, I just want to look at, because I've given 7 minutes to talk, I'll be brief, to look at very briefly on the collection side and then the distribution side. On the collection side, definitely there's a huge potential to use zakat as an alternative source for humanitarian goals. I was looking at the wealth of the MENA region. Zakat is actually more related to 2.5% on the wealth. And in the MENA, the wealth in 2011 was reported to be 2.7 trillion US dollars. And if you calculate 2.5% just on this wealth, it amounts to 65 billion US dollars. And this is an annual amount which can be used just in the MENA region for different development, poverty, and humanitarian goals. So the potential in terms of figures is there, but the question is how do we in some ways collect this amount and distribute it to make the social impact. So this brings me to the distribution part. And as has been identified in the report, zakat is collected and distributed in different ways. I think a bulk of it probably is distributed by individuals. They're distributed to people they know, their relatives, friends, people in their locality. The second group is, of course, organizations, and here we have non-profit organizations, zakat organizations which collect and distribute. And third, of course, is the government. Now, when it comes to individuals, I think in terms of development impact, it's very low because most of it goes into consumption. So the people who are distributing zakat at the individual level, they give it to people they know, and most of it probably does not go into any productive activities, but is used in consumption. At the organizational level, again, the report identifies it, and we have seen examples of 2 organizations in the presentation. Part of it is used for humanitarian goals, and the other is related to poverty and development-related goals. Now, in terms of government, actually, we don't know how the zakat collected by governments are used, because in most cases there's not too much transparency, and that's one of the reasons that people, they do not trust governments in terms of zakat. And in countries where government is collecting zakat, the collection is not too high. Now, given this perspective, the issue is in terms of humanitarian using zakat for humanitarian goals. I think the main thing is about how do we structure the delivery, the distribution of zakat, so that people have trust in organizations, and as such donate and give the zakat to the organization. So the main thing would be to move from individual giving to organizations. But for that to happen, there has to be trust in terms of the organizations being transparent of what they're doing with the zakat funds. The other issue, of course, was related to I think in the report an issue was raised whether humanitarian efforts, because they are uncertain, can we use zakat, for example, collected in a certain year for future years? And these are some ideological or conceptual issues which need to be addressed. For example, if we look at the conflicts and also the risks of natural disasters and things like that, how can we use the zakat collected in a certain year and keep it for the years risks and events which occur in future years? And I think there is some need to look at these issues. One way to look at it maybe is to expand or redefine what poverty is, not in terms of income, but also the risks and vulnerability which people face. And if that is, this definition is accepted, then we can also expand the use of zakat in humanitarian goals. Now, the other issue which is raised in the report is that actually the potential is there. We do not need to divert funds from development and poverty-related activities to humanitarian. If the Zakat collection can be increased to a higher level, then a part of this can be used for humanitarian objectives. Now, this was mainly a national level discussion. The issue now arises in terms of international help, because a lot of times the humanitarian needs are in countries which are, for example, right now we have conflicts in the Middle East, Syria. How do we transfer Zakat funds to these countries? And I think there we have some structural problems. The first is when organizations, they collect Zakat and want to go and distribute it beyond their national boundaries, there are some restrictions. I think that these restrictions are increasingly getting more and more stringent. Due to different reasons. For example, I think in a lot of countries it's very difficult for non-profit organizations to transfer funds to other countries without government approval. So you have to go through the government agencies for this transfer. The other, of course, issue is that if you want to use an international body like United Nations, again the issue of trust building, and the people have to have faith in these organizations that the money they are giving will go to the right places. Now, one of the things which again is mentioned in the report is that there is a belief that the cost of delivering services from international organizations is too high. So there probably is a need for an international body like Islamic Development Bank. People will probably have more faith in an international body which is from OIC members. And the problem there again, I personally know that there was an initiative which was taken by Islamic Development Bank some time back to establish an international Zakat organization, but somehow there was some resistance from the member countries for that, and I think there is an organization which exists in Malaysia, but in terms of impact, we don't see, or in terms of their activities, we don't see much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Habib, for this thoughtful insight onto the way Zakat is collected and distributed and its potential. I would like now, Louisa, to look at the key findings from the report from a perspective of a humanitarian agency that and focuses on the extent which Zakat is currently used to respond to the humanitarian crises we have in different parts of the world.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm standing in for my colleague Sadia, who was supposed to speak today, but unfortunately she's been taken ill. So apologies if you don't find me 100% prepared as a result. Did my mic not? Can you hear me now? Is that better? So our initial reflections on the report are that it's very welcome and it's much needed. Firstly, because, as Jamila mentioned, Is that better? Can you hear me now? Yes? Alright, is this one better? Shall I start again? So I was just saying that I'm standing in for a colleague who was unfortunately taken ill today. So apologies for not 100% prepared, as it was slightly short notice. So some of these reflections on the report are firstly that it's very welcome and much needed. As Dr. Jamila mentioned earlier, the scale and number of humanitarian crises is ever increasing. But also it's good to have some recognition of this institution of funding humanitarian development work that has existed for centuries and perhaps has been overlooked to some extent. So just a brief introduction to Islamic Relief's current journey in developing our Zakat policy, which I mentioned earlier, and there's a small case study within the report. We have been collecting and distributing Zakat for 30 years, ever since we were founded in 1984. And our approach to Zakat has always been to follow the general principles outlined, so what Chloe mentioned earlier with regards to the 8 categories, but we have never had a sort of formal and cohesive policy. And so as we've grown exponentially and our offices have expanded to now work in over 40 countries around the world, fundraising and implementing. Each office has followed its own interpretations of the same principles, but with slight variations, and we've found that as we're collecting more and more zakat, and in 2013 we collected about 20 million globally, 20 million pounds that is, about 30 to 32 million US dollars, we found a need to have a more cohesive approach. So we did a number of intensive and extensive consultations with our field fundraising and fundraising offices, and also with Islamic scholars from around the world, both from the West and from Muslim majority countries. And we found that our offices around the world have been using zakat for a whole range of projects, so both humanitarian and development across all sectors that we work in, so from water to livelihoods, to child protection, welfare and so on. Zakat has been comprehensively used. And we came to learn a lot about zakat through the consultations that we did with scholars, including the principles which govern it and its transformative capacity. So we commend the report for the really intensive data collection that's gone on, and obviously, as Chloe mentioned, that's the focus of the global humanitarian assistance, is to look at the data. But what we really found when we, coming out of our consultations, was the need to focus not just on the numbers and on the funding potential, but on the spirit and the ethos of zakat, and indeed Islamic social assistance in general. So you'll find mentioned in the report that those who receive zakat are known as mustahik, which comes from the word haq, or right. And so those who receive zakat, it is their God-given right, and those who are obliged to pay are referred to in the Quran as those in whose wealth there is a right for the poor and needy. And therefore it's not a matter of being charitable or kind of good-willed, but actually giving is something that is mandated upon Muslims. They're doing what is obliged of them and what is due to others. And so this is similar to what we now call in humanitarian parlance the rights-based approach. This is something that's existed within our tradition for centuries. So we've got a report that's coming out next week, and my colleague Helen at the back has some briefings which she can give you about talking about Islamic social financing, including zakat, but also other forms, and it refers to the need for a moral economy, which is an economy based not just on profits but on equality and social justice. So for us, if zakat is to be recognised more within the humanitarian fora as a form of funding, we would also hope that some of its ethos and spirit would be taken into consideration too. And we find within the principles surrounding zakat there are a number of finer details which contribute to this spirit and ethos. So a lot of the scholars we spoke to talked about the concept of ownership, the idea that zakat is intended as it's the right of the beneficiary. They have a right to ownership over it. And that means that the implications for a humanitarian agency like us to make sure that all our programs are beneficiary driven, and that the goods we distribute are those which are clearly needed and wanted by the beneficiary communities, and that they should also receive any necessary training or capacity building to use what they receive to the best of their ability. And again, this is now recognised as good practice within the humanitarian sector, so participatory approaches and needs-based needs assessments and so on. But this is something that has been present within the tradition of zakat for a long time. Finally, with regards to the spirit and ethos of zakat, building social bonds is a really key part of that. And zakat is about generating bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood between people. And so the preference for zakat is initially for it to be used within the locality where it is generated, or where it's collected, in order to build those bonds. And as the report mentions, and as our scholarly consultations found, there is a caveat that where the needs are greater elsewhere, zakat can and should be used there. But as countries around the world, which have traditionally been more affluent, are going through their own economic crises, we're finding that there might be a need now to look more at keeping at least a portion of our zakat internally. And so our new policy does contain the stipulation that all our fundraising offices should look at the needs within their own countries, look to see whether there is a need to use some of their zakat locally. So this is already happening in Islamic Relief USA, Germany, Australia, and we've recently appointed a coordinator to look at domestic programmes in the UK. She's been working with us for about 6 months now, so we hope, God willing, to launch those soon. And in terms of the obstacles and challenges that we face, just briefly, we have two main challenges, I suppose, on either side of Zakat, one being fundraising, one being distribution. So with regards to fundraising, there's sometimes a lack of awareness amongst Muslims about Zakat, and the report mentions there are kind of some quite complex calculations to be made sometimes around the amount of wealth people have, and I suppose as finance becomes more and more complex with various forms of assets, both tangible and intangible financial assets and so on, we feel that it's part of our responsibility to help educate our donors as to their responsibility to give zakat. And then on the other side, when it comes to distribution, there can be sometimes a lack of awareness also around the principles surrounding distribution of zakat, and that's again why we put the policy together to bring some clarity to that. But really the policy that we've come up with has been both principled but also flexible, and most of the scholars we spoke to did not give very prescriptive or narrow definitions of either the 8 categories or ownership or any of the key principles, so that there is a lot of flexibility within the use of zakat while still maintaining its spirit and ethos. So yeah, we welcome the report, and we really hope that it's the start of both a new source of funding, but also a new way of looking at humanitarian funding and the moral economy and the ethics.
Thank you very much, Louisa, for highlighting this magic or the spirit of zakat. And if I can just highlight one example that I remember that explains the spirit of zakat is, as I was volunteering for a charity, I received a call from a donor, a lady who was saying that she wanted to pay zakat, and that was from the UK. And she was on benefits, right? She didn't have any money, but yet she wanted to do all her best, to pay that money and to give that money to people who deserve it and who don't have nothing in other parts of the world. And that's really the spirit of compassion and understanding people who are living in a much better situation than ours. So without no further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Abdul Wahab Nurwani, who is actually a well-known figure amongst people who are involved in the Islamic charitable sector, and for many years as a thinker, as someone who's involved with many initiatives and organizations. So I'm really proud that and happy that he's here today and was able to make it, to talk about actually how reading at the report, how zakat is being used in the Gulf to support the humanitarian response, but also how in the future it can be used, and what are the major challenges, barrier to this, and how we can overcome those.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. Today actually it's my pleasure to be with you, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this discussion group. I read the paper and I heard today with Flu how she was trying to put things together really to make it understandable for everybody what is zakat and how it is spent. And Dr. Habib just talked about the MENA region, which in the Middle East where a lot of funds, private funds are there, and a lot of zakat funds are there as well. Today at 5:30 I had a meeting through the telephone conference with the president of IDB for 1 hour. The time difference is 3 hours between here and there, so it was and there we are putting an initiative, I'm part of that, for endowment initiative. And IDB, under the umbrella of IDB, there is called Awqaf Capital Group, which is actually employing Awqaf money, that's endowment cash money, to make it available. And the IDB will take this initiative by investing $100 million, and they're seeking for this year $300 million. And whatever actually the benefit will come from that is going to be run by an international executive group for management in Bahrain. And this is one of the initiatives as well for funding, and hopefully within a year or two it's going to be around $2 billion. So this is one of the initiatives, but the cut is a huge, really, I think more than 65 billion, because I know a single individual person every year he's bringing the car for around $800 million, a single individual. So there is a huge fund there lying, but as Klu and Dr. Habib mentioned, that there are gap of trust between the payer and the recipients. And if you come to the international arena, international agencies, they can be part of this. But I think if they look, the donors actually, who pay the zakat, every single Muslim is a zakat payer. Every single Muslim is a zakat payer. So if he has the threshold to be of money which he has, so if you calculate that, and they have to build a trust between the recipient and the donor, and international agencies, whatever it is in the world, either the cost of expenditure and the executives is too high, so they will be reluctant. The second important thing is that on the top of these agencies, there are not Muslim figures there, so they don't know who is they're dealing with. Although they are working in the Muslim world or some of the crisis areas like in the Middle East or somewhere else, but they want to know a figure, rely on it, that this money is going to be spent on the proper way. And this is, I think, something we need to touch, say UNHCR or UNICEF or WHO or whatever it is. There must be some Muslim figures on this top of these agencies, so at least that they can facilitate the communication between the card payer and the recipients. Second important thing is that actually how we can channel these huge funds. There is some political barrier there, because most of the government, they don't want to channel their zakat funds outside their countries, or they want to control that. For example, our own government, Saudi Arabia, they have a governing body to control the cards, and they collect the cards. But they collect the cards from whom? From business community. But individuals, they cannot collect the cards from them. But they don't have hand on the individuals' funds. But business community, because they can control their business export, import, and so on, so they know how much the card they can pay, and they have to pay the card. And this is on the regulatory basis. But individuals, there is a huge amount of funds for individuals, and this is obligatory. The Muslims have to pay the card. So they don't have a hand on that. And they open the door for these individuals to pay the card for charities, local charities and international charities. But there is another strong barrier there, that counter-terrorism created an obligation that no money can be transferred through the banks to charities, international charities. And this is one of the strong barriers in front of individuals to contribute to the international arena. Now, for example, personally, I want to transfer my money to Islamic Relief. The banking system there will not allow me to transfer this money. So that's actually making or creating an environment where individuals go and take their money and distribute it to the beneficiaries. And this is, I'm talking that, well, I gave you an example of a single individual of $800 million. So you can imagine the huge amount of money not only in Saudi Arabia, but all the Gulf region, a huge amount of money is channeled through personal individuals to the beneficiaries, wherever it is. So people, for example, they go themselves to Turkey because there is a Syrian crisis, and there are organizations there, they can help them directly, and or they go through third party. Like one, for example, even one as an organization, they cannot transfer their money through the banks, which is an international organization. So you have to go through a third party, a known company registered, and they transfer the money to this company, then that company will transfer to the beneficiary or other. So this is one of the big obstacles there in the region, which the organizations are dealing with, really, and individuals also. The second important thing is that IDB can, as Dr. Habib mentioned, they can put an initiative, but it will be very difficult really. But I think still there is space for such an initiative to come in and to create a platform for the CAT funds under the umbrella of IDB. IDB is a trustworthy, big organization which can accommodate the people, individuals or companies from different parts of the world. And they also can channel the expenditure or the spending of this money to different organizations and the beneficiaries around the world. So this can be, this initiative can really be targeting IDB to be one of the main umbrella for channeling Zakats or Zakat funds throughout the Muslim world. Although there are some obstacles, but I think there will be space for this initiative to be mobilized and to make it active really. And they can contribute to most of the needs assessment in different parts of the world. They have done some survey about the CAT and the needs assessment programs, and there are presentations there, but unfortunately I've been told that no presentation except one is going to be here. So for that reason, really, otherwise I could have showed you some of the IDB data which they collected from different parts of the world about the CAT and contribution of the CAT and so on, which they've done a survey for that. And I think the space is there, but I think this is a very good initiative to start with and to go on for the future, to build up a strategy really, and to make people come on a common platform where they can understand each other, and building trust also is a very important factor, and creating also an environment which we can overcome these barriers of counter-terrorism and money transfer and things like that. This, because of that, actually after 9/11 we initiated this humanitarian forum to tackle this problem of which is mentioned in this paper about transparency and so on. So we are working on that, but it needs a huge effort, and the humanitarian summit in Istanbul is going to be held in 2016. I think is going to be one of the main issues, how to channel this money throughout the world and to sort out this problem which really the international NGOs are facing of transferring of money because of counter-terrorism and so on. So I hope if organizations or people joining here can contribute even in that, because humanitarian forum are putting a lot of efforts really together with the UN for this summit really by doing consultancy in different parts of the world. Thank you very much really, and appreciate for me here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul. I was just also going to highlight on the issue of counterterrorism that the Humanitarian Policy Group of ODI has published with support from the Muslim Charities Forum reports earlier this month, looking at the impact of counterterrorism legislation on UK humanitarian aid perceptions and reality. And there's lots of interesting findings which highlight that this is a responsibility that we all need to address as a collective, because as we speak today, because of those regulations, we're not able to reach people in Syria, in Somalia, and I'm sure it's going to happen in Yemen now as a result of those legislations and what we call the chilling effect. And also the Parliament in the UK, after many agencies voiced out those concerns, has suggested to the government actually to and asked the Director of Public Prosecution to provide guidance for agencies that operate where there are proscribed groups present. So without no further ado, I'd like to give, allow space now for questions. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, just about less than 30 minutes. But also people are able to ask questions online, and please use the hashtag GHA Zakat 2015 for those of you who are asking questions online. So I guess we can get a few questions now and then ask the panelists to respond. Yes. If you can also introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Luba. I'm with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I'm also doing my PhD in development. First of all, thank you very much, Chloe and everyone, for very, very interesting time you have.
I just want to say thank you to Louisa, because you raise very, very interesting points that I think we should really ask ourselves. I mean, I'm going to be very quick, but I'm going to ask the question that we saw in the report the logistical and ideological barriers for the inclusion of Zakat into the international humanitarian system. But rather than looking at it this way, why don't we look at the logistical and ideological potentials of Zakat being used as it is used today? All of us here, I mean, most of the people who are working in humanitarian assistance today recognize the failures of the international system in providing humanitarian assistance. More and more international organizations are moving into more flexible, socially oriented cash transfers, locally, designed, etc., which is all very much part and parcel of Zakat. The social role, for example, in working with Syrian refugees in Lebanon, we noticed that the most successful programs are the ones that were happening in host communities, where host communities gave support to the refugees outside of the international humanitarian system, because this created, ties between I'm not going to go into details, but I mean, why should we ask ourselves, how can we go from individuals to organizations, when even organizations are going into a more Zakat-oriented, Islamic-oriented approach, without calling it so, of course, but I don't want to over-romanticize this, but at the time when the Zakat was done properly, there is still some regions in Turkey today where they distribute some grains on the mountains. And if you go back to this tradition, it's basically when one of the Caliph Umar was in charge and the Zakat was distributed, there was still extra money that they didn't know what to do with, because everyone had enough money, so they distributed the grain just for the birds. So I mean, the Zakat can be very empowering in that sense. My question is, why move back rather than forward? If we have a flexible system, why take it into a bureaucratic, not flexible system? The second question is based on also something that you touched upon, which is ideologically driven. Some people prefer to give Zakat in terms of cash rather than through programs, which is more empowering, more ownership. Now, through a very brief experience with a non-Muslim person working in our organization, he didn't understand really this concept and grappled with it. So really, there is no trade-off between making sure that it's ideologically implemented the right way Islamically, and at the same time incorporating it to a more international system which doesn't stand on Islamic ideological pillars. Thank you, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Helen.
Thank you. My name is Helen Safsky. I'm from Islamic Relief, and I work on the UN liaison group. I wanted to build on what the speakers just said, that in the financing for development conversations that are going on in New York at the moment, we've been advocating for what Louisa mentioned, which is not just looking at how you can essentially tap religious people for extra money, but how can you take the principles of their more moral economy and economic system into consideration when you're looking at development. And I think that speaks to what the previous speaker just said about how these different forms of money collection can actually build social bonds, can actually support participatory development. And I suppose to respond to your question about, why not, in a sense, just leave things as they are because it really generates good relations at the local level. I think it's important to see that it shouldn't be one system or the other. International organisations have a huge amount to bring. Often the money that is spent through Zakat isn't actually spent in a sustainable way. So it may build social bonds, but it may be looking at immediate need rather than looking at, for example, building resilience in the long term, or disaster risk reduction, or addressing issues of gender imbalance and gender-based violence in the community. So I think what would be really useful is to have more research into how we can actually marry up different responses from international organisations. But as has already been mentioned, the counter-terrorism laws really prevent us from doing this. Now, I won't go into that because there's already been referenced a huge amount of work done on that. I'd really love to see a follow-up meeting with DFID, and I saw there's someone from DFID here, I won't put them on the spot, but from the big organisations, because we don't get a response from this at the moment, and we really do. The question that I really have is on the state side of things. It was great to hear a really practical example about the Islamic Development Bank, but working with the kind of national level, more formal Zakat collection forums. But do we have any good practice? Do we have any good case studies of national government Zakat collection forums working with UN agencies? Because I agree that we need to start that guidance, we need to start that interface between senior UN people and national Zakat platforms, but at the same time we need to start with some good practice. That's what always seems to be the best way.
I guess I'll answer these questions first and then get the other questions. So if I can ask Dr. Habib to answer the question. The first question which was asked is about why don't we move backwards rather than forwards. Louisa to answer about how can we take these principles to talk about development and humanitarian, but also how can we ideologically implement zakat and put it into the humanitarian system when the humanitarian system is not Islamic per se. And the question for Dr. Abdul Wahab is about the case studies that Helen asked. And again, I think that the same question I've asked Louisa, I'll ask it to Chloe about implementing zakat when the humanitarian system is not Islamic. So if I could start with Dr. Habib.
Thank you. Actually, I think the focus of this report is very narrow in terms of how zakat can be used for humanitarian purposes. And the humanitarian issues arise mainly from conflicts and, for example, natural disasters and things like that. When it comes to using zakat for poverty alleviation, development, there's a large literature, and actually a lot of the organizations which I mentioned are doing that. So the potentials and barriers in terms of using it for humanitarian related issues, I think what was discussed in the report. And the reality is that if you're talking about humanitarian help, which are cross-border, we do face these barriers. There are barriers in terms of ideology, whether, for example, I think it's mentioned in the report, if the people affected are non-Muslims, what is the Islamic legal perspective on it? The other issue which has been highlighted by Dr. Abdul Wahab also is if most of the zakat is collected by organizations, can they transfer this without involving the government? Because a lot of people do not trust the government due to the lack of transparency of what's happening. And so I think it is unfortunately the system we operate in that any international response to this humanitarian has to go through governments, and people are reluctant to go through these channels because of lack of trust. Because ultimately when you're talking about zakat, donation, And it is about trust, and people, instead of giving it to government and even organizations, a lot of this is distributed individually. These are the practical problems in terms of having or creating an impact. The problem with individual donation is, of course, it has an impact at the local level, and I think the problem is that we see a lot of it is used for consumption purposes, meeting immediate needs, but it does not create capacity and resilience, which was mentioned. So if it goes through organizations, I think these things are built in the Zakat distribution program.
Firstly, and this might be controversial to say for a fundraising organisation who should be saying give your money to us, but I think that Islamic Relief would not want to discourage the kind of work that you talked about, so locally led, spontaneous, really organic initiatives where people as individuals are supporting, whether it's refugees or other individuals in need, is great. But because most of our fundraising offices are based in Western, more affluent countries working with Muslim minorities, until I suppose these more recent economic crises, there has not been so much need for zakat within the countries that people are wanting to pay zakat, and therefore they've not been able to do that kind of individual giving to somebody they know within the community, because actually the needs have been overseas. And that's where, I think as Helen said, it doesn't need to be one or the other. That's where international organisations are needed to do the work that is international. When it comes to incorporating things like ownership or donors who want to give in cash and take that perhaps more traditional conservative interpretation of ownership, when it comes to humanitarian work, in the sort of purest form of aid delivery, that's rarely an issue. Things we're giving will be, food, NFIs, non-food items, mattresses, blankets, medicines, things which have very clear ownership, although as was mentioned, they are kind of consumables. When it comes to development work, which this report obviously didn't focus on, it's about humanitarian work, we have found a way to marry those up, often by part financing the zakat. So for example, take a livelihood project that is looking to build local capacity to have more sustainable livelihoods, perhaps in an area that's stricken by drought, and so farming is not really a long-term option. You might want to train people in new techniques, handicrafts and so on. So cash might be given for grants for new businesses, and the tools and materials might be given as pure ownership, but the training costs might be covered by sadaqah, which is a voluntary form of charity and has no restrictions really on how it can be used as long as it's a charitable purpose, or other kind of forms of donations. So there's that part balancing. But one interesting thing we found during our consultation is that the 8 categories Chloe talked about earlier, some of them within that verse in the Quran are preceded by the pronoun to, which is where the idea of ownership is taken, so zakat should be given to the poor, to the needy, and others with the pronoun kind of loosely translated is to be spent on, which is less restricted in terms of ownership, so zakat can be spent on certain categories without being given directly to. And the report mentioned that the category of in the cause of God is perhaps the least easy to marry up with humanitarian causes, but some of the scholars we spoke to took this actually in a very broad interpretation and said in the cause of God means anything that is good, because all that is good is in God's way. So even things like the training that I mentioned to use the livelihood tools, some scholars said we could fund with zakat under that category of in the cause of God because it is doing good work. So that I don't think it's bleak. I think there are lots of opportunities for us to marry up zakat principles and current ways of working.
Thank you very much, Julia. But I think I will respond to, as earlier we heard about the programs in the Islamic Relief driven by beneficiaries, where the recipient here of zakat are 8 categories. And most of the NGOs in the Muslim world, they actually design their recipients according to this. And one of the things which we found actually, that most of the Muslims, they pay the zakat during Ramadan, the fasting month. And the payment during Ramadan because they pay Zakat, and because the reward to pay the Zakat in Ramadan is the highest for them back. So that's why most of the funds in Muslim NGOs is coming during Ramadan, during fasting month. And so we have to think really for the recipients, the 8 categories, how to design the NGOs to be the recipient for the zakat for these 8 categories, which will be either these humanitarian funds, whatever it is for humanitarian causes or not, but it has to be under these 8 categories. And there are a lot of literatures. It used to be every year during Ramadan in back in Jeddah, one of the business known figures called Salih Kamil, he used to make or held a 3-day meeting bringing scholars from all over the world for the zakat, how it is funded, distributed and collected, and what are the different means of utilizing the zakat funds for development. And these literatures are there. If anybody needs, I can facilitate really for these literatures available. So a lot of work has been done how to spend the zakat funds and how to utilize the zakat funds for development. One of good experience which we have in Islamic Relief is that for microfinance, for example, this is direct funding but for the business model. When they're poor, they have a business model or they have a small project, we directly fund them. And we have a good result really, outcome of this, and they are developing it to international funding system all over the world for microfinance. And this experience really is growing now as one of the tools for development or alleviating poverty as well. I think we can add more and more. The ground is open, and it's not really limited to whatever is coming in the paper. We can help even to bring for you so many reviews and literatures being done, but unfortunately most of it which I came across is in Arabic, but we can facilitate it to be translated and available. A lot of efforts being done on this line, which can we can build the ground for future really perspective for this line and how we can bring the humanitarian aspects. Or we can even bring some scholars to think what are the areas to be involved in. I don't think there is a barrier to spend for Christian community, because now Islamic Relief have just implemented a project to build schools supported by IDB in Haiti. And it was a project for $5 million, which they built schools according for after the crisis which happened in Haiti. And Haiti, there was a very little Muslim community there, but the beneficiaries were Muslims and non-Muslims in that particular community. So I think there is no barrier ideological from that part of thinking, but it can be more elaborated by bringing some scholars, experts in this field, and make these literatures also available for everybody to know what is zakat and how it is collected and how it can be utilized more and more. Because besides that, zakat fund, we have something called zakat al-fitr, which is the end of Ramadan. Is also directed to the poor, and there are ways in different scholars. They have either to pay in sort of grains or dates, or they can pay even money. And that's huge as well, that every single Muslim has to pay. Every single Muslim has to pay. And it should be paid within a week time. The period is very limited as well. And it has to be paid within that particular days before the Eid days. And so this is a huge fund as well. This is a huge fund. And so that can be also utilized and directed really properly for the humanitarian needs. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. sorry, I didn't catch your name because it was before you got the microphone, but I'm going to microwave them, which is a different thing. Thank you. So, I completely agree, and we do talk in the report about how much there is that can be learned from Zakat and from the sort of premise behind Zakat and Islamic social balancing. There's, a lot of people have mentioned the links with cash transfers and transfer of ownership. And I also have seen the Islamic Relief publication on the need for a moral economy, and I think it's absolutely a two-way learning process, and it certainly shouldn't just be about trying to take something and bring it into another community. It needs to be a process of mutual learning and working together. In terms of the direct assistance that Zakat provides, that is hugely valuable, particularly in humanitarian situations, and often it has lower transaction costs than funding that goes through large agencies. It can get to the people who need it more quickly if it's provided directly, and it can be used more flexibly. So there's absolutely a really key role for that sort of financing to play. But I guess the issue is that in a humanitarian situation, coordination is really vital as well. So the point is that we just need a better understanding of all the different resources that are at play and how they're working in order to coordinate that response. It's just about availability of information, really. And I just, in relation to your question on UN agencies working with Zakat conversion agencies, I didn't come across any in my research for the report, but I was looking specifically at humanitarian aid, so I'm not sure if there are any examples of development agencies working with Zakat, with sort of national Zakat agencies, but I didn't come across any evidence of that. But it certainly ought to happen.
He's this man sitting here, the cat house.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm going to take just briefly a few questions and ask the panelists to respond briefly. If you can just stick it to the question rather than comments, please. Fadi, you wanted to be first. But you can introduce the concept of Zakat House for another minute.
Thank you, Abdurrahman. Thank you for the excellent highlighting of a subject I personally believe is a very strategic.
Introduce yourself, please.
A very strategic. I want to promote the cause, not where I'm coming from. My name is Fadi Tana. I'm the CEO of Zakat House, which is a charity hub. The concept is to accommodate and host small strategic charitable projects, support them, which is basically an incubator as they use it in the business concept. And this is something challenging for us to convince people to understand what Zakat can do for a strategic initiative like this. I think the issue of Zakat, I agree with Ruba what you said, that we don't want to really drag the Zakat into the international humanitarian system and basically highlight it as just another source of funding, when to be honest with you, it is actually more powerful than just funding. And it has this, what we call it, the spirit of empowering and changing local communities. And this is really the power of Zakat, is it change, it has this localization feature. And to be honest with you, from now, the implementation of Zakat, when it becomes like a global, we start really seeing that it's not really delivering what's supposed to be delivered. So I think we need to, because this is not my first time I attend a program like this. I went around the world, and people really, especially from our colleagues from the non-Muslim sector, they think that this is really an excellent idea to try to tap in, which is, nobody has problem with it, but it's really is not, it's just another source of funding. So we need really to be careful with this. And we don't want to kill its spirit of being localization, local really power to change things. The problem we have at the moment is, to be honest with you, the present implementation of Zakat in the Muslim world is not strategic and is not giving the Zakat its due, what we call role. It's just now it's become a traditional way of collecting Zakat from those who got money, give it to those who they don't, or maybe transferring most of it away from the countries and from the local societies or local communities. So it's not really making a strategic impact here. There is a lack of data, and you highlighted this, which we're using, and also there is a lack of a general research of excellent project has been implemented through Zakat and how Zakat can really change local communities. So I'll finish with this, Rahman, if you allow me, is really not about just another source of funding. Is a tool for a change and very strong and powerful tool that we really need to instill again its spirit properly. And I think we ask Muslim organizations to take a lead on this and help us as a mainstream humanitarian actors and practitioners to learn from it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I had the gentleman at the back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve Owen from MSF. What are the rules concerning using Zakat for entirely non-Muslim communities?
Sorry, if you could repeat that question, it should be heard.
Sorry, Steve Owen from MSF. My question is, what are the rules regarding use of Zakat for entirely non-Muslim communities?
Okay, that's fine. Yes.
Just a very brief question. You've mentioned the UN agencies and NGOs. Is there a role for the Red Crescent and Red Cross national committees and branches to play in this?
So if you could introduce yourself.
My name is Ivo. I work for BIFMID.
Okay. And final question there.
I think Zakat is politicized as other aid, humanitarian aid is politicized also. And I believe Zakat for everybody. It doesn't say poor, Muslim poor or only something like this. It just says Muslim and just something like that. And my question is, as a Muslim, if I see non-Muslim organizations more effective in delivering aid, can I give my Zakat to that? Is there any restriction on that?
Thank you. Well, since our time is up, I will just ask all the panelists to just give 1 minute of final comment on these 3 points that were made about the rules of Zakat for non-Muslim organization, Zakat and the role of the Red Crescent, the role that the Red Crescent can play, and the non-restrictions on Zakat and only being about efficiency. So just very briefly, 1 minute.
I think one of the things we're trying to understand here is the international humanitarian activities and how Zakat can fit into it. And I think, as we have seen from the questions, there are some issues. One is, as was mentioned, Zakat was always something which was localized. Now, in terms of implementation, of course, again, it's mentioned that the implementation has not been strategic, so it's not having the impact it needs to have. Now, in terms of having Zakat at international level, actually it is I think something new, and it probably is one of these ideological things which need to be settled and discussed among Sharia scholars, whether, for example, you can give it to international organizations, and because it's not local, in countries where you have surplus Zakat, probably it can be transferred to other places. Again, we issue a question about can it be given to non-Muslims, and this, I think Dr. Abdul Wahab mentioned that it can be, but to have, I think it's important to have a discussion among the scholars to resolve these issues which are very contemporary in nature.
Thank you.
Briefly touching on the issue of non-Muslims, just to kind of briefly outline some of the positions that we came across during our scholarly consultations. All the scholars we spoke to were quite clear that there is no explicit verse or prophetic narration restricting Zakat to Muslims. So as the last question I mentioned, the verse talks about the poor and the needy, not the poor Muslims and the needy Muslims. The kind of references that people take to say that it should be restricted to Muslims can be interpreted in a number of ways. So, for example, one of the Prophet's companions who was going to Yemen was told, take zakat from their people and give it to their people. Some people took this to mean take from the Muslims and give to the Muslims, and others took it to mean take from those in Yemen and give to those in Yemen, i.e. keep it local, build those social bonds. So there are a number of ways to look at it, and I mean we didn't find any consensus across the scholars, but we found enough evidence on both sides to say that it's not clear cut and that it would not be completely illegitimate to say yes, we can give it to non-Muslims. So it's vague, but it's
Actually, as Dr. Fadi just said now, that zakat can be a tool of change, not only just for a humanitarian purpose. And it needs proper channeling and proper understanding of that. And if you go back to the category here written for the recipients of zakat, there are several categories, al-fuqara, that mean the poor, which is not defined actually. Who are the poor, the Muslims or non-Muslims? Ibn al-Sabil, the one who are actually the wayfarer or travelers. And al-Ghalimin, the one who are in debt. Masakin, Firriqab. All these are categories, are open categories. And as Dr. Habib said, it needs some scholars to sit down and discuss it, but there are very well literature being written in this line as well. So available also. And the second important thing is that who are effective in the fields as organizations to pay the zakat for. I don't think there is a barrier there, but if line of recipients is very clear, then I think there is no barrier. But the organizations who want to be involved, they have to be also transparent. Because some of the organizations, international organizations, the executive cost is too high, really. So the donors, really, they run away from them. We are in Islamic Relief, for example, also our cost is around 9-something%. Also, that's a burden, really. We want to decrease it more and more as a cost of management and so on. So I think this by itself is a barrier for the donors, really. And creating a dialogue, direct dialogue between different NGOs on one platform is one of the things which really can be discussed. In one country, for example, here in the UK or in other European countries, we can create a platform where people can discuss this matter directly. And that is a bridge building actually between different organizations to understand better the different communities and the way of payment. Thank you.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I think my colleagues are probably far better placed than I to answer the questions about who can benefit from zakat and who to give it to. But just on the gentleman's question about the Red Cross, and again, I'm not the expert here, but it would strike me that the Red Cross is a global organisation that has incredibly strong local networks and local links, and through its national societies, which to me would seem to chime quite strongly with the role of zakat used locally. So I personally see no reason why there shouldn't be a role there. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to abuse my position as chairman just to answer the question the gentleman asked about, can zakat go to non-Muslim organizations? Now we had the case a few years back where actually you had non-Muslim organizations, NGOs here in the UK, one or two, who were raising funds, zakat funds, and saying to the Muslim community, you can pay your zakat through us and so on. And also we had a web portal, online, that receives donation and so on, which was saying you can give your zakat to these organizations. Now these organizations included, lots of mainstream organization. And the question we pointed out to them is, what are the rules you use? Do you get advice from Islamic scholars and so on to understand how it's spent? And the question we received is, no, it's just a fundraising tool. And I think that highlights the question that Fadi mentioned about the importance of the principles and ethos around zakat, and that's really what we need to focus on. It's really more powerful and much more than just the funding element. So with this, I would like to thank you all, for participating and taking part in this event. There is going to be an opportunity for networking now, coffee and drinks served. And I would like to thank the patience of the people who've been following us online, because we had some technical issues. There is going to be more work in this area. There's lots of agencies that are working on this. And just to highlight also that ODI and the Humanitarian Policy Group through EVA published a report in November talking about the humanitarianism and the history of humanitarianism in the Arab world, which is also another suggested reading that I would recommend. And finally, I would like to thank also the people who made this event possible, Kat, Sarah, obviously Chloe, and Omeima from our organization. So thank you all for attending. Thank you very much.